Dan, I was asked the other night, I was giving a speech about Bitcoin. So I figured we'll go right at it, you know? I mean, why waste time? We don't have a lot of time to waste. Here's what I said, without knowing very much about Bitcoin. I said, the world is going to need a digital currency and a digital way of making payments that everybody, and I say this, by the way, just so you know, I'm a PayPal guy.
I know you are.
I swear, I can show you. You don't believe me?
I saw the tattoo.
Okay.
I saw it.
I run the whole band on PayPal. Okay?
Couldn't be better.
So here's what I said. I said it needs a digital currency. It needs a digital means of transferring and storing value and doing all those things that are done with money, but it hasn't decided yet what that is going to be. Is that the right way to think about it right now?
No, not really.
I like that.
So let me start off with, I think it is crucial that we figure out a way of utilizing technology to democratize financial services. I think we've got a population of almost 2 billion people who sit outside the financial services industry in the world, 70 million adults in the US who find it incredibly difficult to manage and move their money. It takes them time. They wait in lines to cash a check, send money to a loved one, pay a bill. Last year, Americans spent $141 billion in interest and fees to manage and move money. That's on average 10% of their disposable income, the same amount they spend on food. So we have got to think about how do we use technology to make those basic consumer financial transactions simpler, faster, more secure, and importantly, much less expensive. And we can do that. And so I think that, as I said in the journal, managing and moving money should be a right for all citizens, not a privilege for the affluent. And I think technologies like blockchain, the underlying protocol for Bitcoin, and others can help to enable that. But they're only enablers of a goal that we should all have as an industry, which is to drive financial health.
Are there 3 things we could do now to bring that about that are sort of low-hanging fruit in this regard?
Yeah, I think in our industry, in the financial services industry, I think there are a couple things that we've got to do. One, I think financial literacy and financial education is sort of the foundational level to start driving economic health. Then we need to figure out how do we use technology to help make these transactions, budgeting, that kind of thing, simpler and easier for people. Like you can give somebody an education on a budget and savings and tools, but have you ever tried to keep a budget before? It's incredibly difficult writing down every one of those transactions, keeping track of them. But if you did things digitally, you could categorize all that through software. You could set goals and create savings habits and incent those savings habits. So I think software and technology can be an enabler that stacks on top of financial literacy. And then finally, I made this call at the big industry conference in Las Vegas earlier this week. I think the moonshot for our generation, for those of us in the financial services industry, is partnering together to create value propositions that underserved populations, whether they be lower income, middle income, entrepreneurs, small businesses, have access to capital where they can make a real difference in our economy, in our neighborhoods, with our citizens. So I don't think we can shirk from that responsibility. I think the business community has to stand up and take a stand. We have to be a force for good. I think it's a moral obligation that we do so.
Let me ask Greg a more mundane question. What are you teaching these days about cash? Do you teach students that cash is expensive? It was sort of a revelation for me. I mean, I've heard numbers that are a bit under that, but the idea that cash is expensive, we don't really teach that too much.
Well, I do try to teach the basics of financial and monetary economics to my freshmen at Harvard. I also do talk to them a little bit about Bitcoin, and I wouldn't, by the way, put a penny into it myself of my own money, because I don't understand why zero is at a perfectly fine equilibrium price for a Bitcoin. So I'm skeptical. I'd be skeptical of about investing in Bitcoin, but figuring out like the optimal allocation of assets between cash and riskier assets is sort of the essence of finance, and certainly a basic building block of my course.
But one of the things that Dan was talking about is that cash is expensive, digital cash is less expensive, and yet, from the time that I spent, by the way, in Russia, cash and the currency have these sort of nationalist things attached to them. You talk to people about getting rid of their currency, which a lot of Fed guys have talked about, because it enables, there are reasons why you could go to zero interest rates. There are reasons. Don't take people's cash away, even though it's more expensive to hold it.
Yeah, I mean, my colleague Ken Rogoff has a book called The Curse of Cash, and he's talked about getting rid of cash, in particular large denomination notes. But he says he's been getting death threats because people are so upset at the prospect that cash would disappear and that money would become purely electronic. But I think we're moving in that direction.
Can I just comment quickly on that? 12% of underserved populations are victims of crime because they carry cash around. Cash is inherently less secure than digital means. You're not doing away with currencies when you go digital, right? You still have the underlying fiat currency that supports a digital management and movement of it, but it's an inherently more efficient way to go and do basic transactions. You can save, in some cases, up to 80% of the costs. And if you can pass along those savings to consumers and people who really need it, to either start a business, an entrepreneur, family that's trying to somehow educate their kids and create more opportunity, we should take advantage of that. And 85% of the world's transactions are still in cash, but that doesn't mean that it isn't moving towards digital, and it doesn't do away with underlying regulations or currency. It's just a different form.
Peter, you're trying to teach a whole different idea about cash to people, which is, and I have this problem all day long, which is when I get beyond the 6-0 thing, I can't deal with it. I go to the computer, I gotta use the commas and stuff. We're
These commas are very useful, yes.
But I don't have the, what is it? It's, it would be E to the 13th is what the place we're really doing most of our business these days, right? E to the 13th, it's the 10 to the 13th, right? 10 to the 13th, yeah, it shows up as E in the spreadsheet, right? 10 to the 13th is where we do most of the business these days.
Error.
What's that?
That's an error.
Yeah, whatever. Like most of my math, but one thing that we hear a lot about is that we're dealing with this $20 trillion of debt. And the news people say trillion, like we're supposed to be scared of trillion. Should we be all that scared of it, or should we put it in perspective of it's a $19 trillion economy? So how worried should we really be?
Well, the answer is yes and yes. Yes, you should be scared of it, and yes, you should look at it relative to the economy. So when most economists look at the debt picture of a given country, they compare it to the GDP. Right now, we're at about 75% of GDP. The 20 trillion includes some obligations we have to ourselves.
It's right, not the debt held by the public.
The Social Security Trust Fund that we spent already,
right.
That's in that list.
It's not in the lockbox, huh?
No, we're still looking for it. So at 75% of GDP, that's a big number. I mean, when the European Union was founded, you had to be below 60 to be admitted. and we're sitting here at 75%. But honestly, that's not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is looking out over the next couple of decades. So what we're facing is we have a big generation of baby boomers coming through the retirement system. There's about 80 million of them. 10,000 will turn 65 today and every day for the next 17 years. So they're coming through a huge influx into the retirement system. We're all living much longer, which is great, but it means more years in retirement. And then you combine that large group with a very inefficient health care system that we have in this country. We spend way more on health care than many other nations. And you have a federal debt picture that makes the 20 trillion look like a small number. So our foundation is dedicated towards raising awareness and trying to challenge that, and to address that challenge.
This is something that it seems like the average American gets, but not the average congressperson.
Well, they get it, yes. Do they have the courage to do something about it? I mean, it's a pretty easy to understand problem, and we do a lot of research and polling and surveys and so forth. We have a fiscal confidence index we put out every month that is very low every month because people get it, they're concerned about it, they think it should be a top priority, they think we should address it. So the citizens do get it. Leaders in Congress, this is a big political challenge. I mean, it's to go around saying we have to tighten our belts or raise taxes or cut spending is not as, it's not as easy to win. When
Greg, why hasn't it happened? Or whatever.
If you ask economists how to solve this problem, which I think is very important, I think Michael's exactly right. The solution that's very popular among economists is to raise the retirement age, which people become eligible for Medicare and Social Security. And the reason that's popular is we only have a few levers. I mean, one of the levers is vastly higher taxes in the next generation. The other possibility is cutting benefits for somebody who's 85 years old, which seems particularly cruel, or asking somebody, the young elderly, that's sort of 65-year-old, to work a few more years. And that seems, to many economists, the best solution. If you poll the American public about that, they hate that idea. And I think that's probably why congressmen aren't embracing this, is because ultimately they're answering to the public, and the public doesn't think that's a good idea. I don't think the public really wants to do anything about it now. And Michael's Foundation is trying to convince the public to do it, I think.
Yeah, but I think what they don't do is explain why we need to do this, right? So if they never tell America, this is important, we have to do this, of course they're not going to want to do that. But if we had more leadership in Congress where they were saying, this is really important, your future's at stake, your future income is at stake, your wage levels are at stake, then I think they'd be more open to, Simpson Bowles extended the retirement age by 2 years over a 40-year period. So it's very gradual. So someone my age would have to work 6 months.
Pardon me, but the ridiculousness of this conversation is the discussion in Washington right now is about $1.5 trillion tax cut.
It is.
In other words, raising the deficit by $1.5 trillion, which I'm not saying what you're saying is not important. It's just that nobody's really thinking or talking about it at all. Dan, let me ask you the question about for your company. We talk about cutting the corporate tax. Is it meaningful to you?
It'll be what it'll be. I mean, honestly, it isn't a thing that I'm focused on. That isn't our mission, our brand has to be about the values and the mission that we have as a company, which is democratizing financial services. We honestly, we'll see what Congress comes up with and what they pass. But our focus is on hyper-serving those segments of the market where we can make a real difference. And I know we have a lot of policy discussions, and happy to have any of them at any time, but I think here's the issue. 50% of Americans have less than $400 of savings. So you're wondering, are they thinking about the deficit, or they're not. They're wondering how to get by. If we're wondering why they're anxious and worried about the future, it's because they're one step away from really going into a deepening crisis. We think about, what is the engine of economic growth in our country? And that engine is entrepreneurs and small business. But they're having a hard time getting loans, right? And so when I think about technology, this isn't and helping that. We use data to give loans to small businesses. We don't even look at FICO scores, right? We use our own data and algorithms to go and do that. 25% of the loans we give to small businesses are in the 3% of counties where 10 or more banks have closed branches. So I think about how, and when we give a loan to a small business, their average sales go up by 22%. So there's a real need on the demand side of this, right? On what we can generate as an economy. This isn't about, maybe it makes economic sense to raise retirement age or whatever it may be. I'm not arguing that point one way or another. What I'm saying is that as a business and as what we can control and what the financial services industry can do, it's really generating more jobs, more security, more savings, more financial health.
How have you found your loss rates when you don't use FICO scores?
Because we use our own data, and we think that our...
And are you outperforming FICO scores?
Right. We think we actually have a better methodology than FICO scores. Because we look at more things. FICO scores only look at kind of your credit movement. They don't look at, like, are you paying your rent? Are you paying your bills on time? What are your sales as a small business? So if you can expand that data set, you can responsibly lend to more segments of the population, and they put that money to work. They can, have more financial security, hire more people. To me, this is the promise.
It's a pretty cool story.
It really is a great story. One, it's for underserved populations. It's in underserved segments, locations of the country that really need it, and sales go up. That's, I think, the promise of what we can do going forward.
Michael?
If I could just bridge to what you're talking about the real microfinance, right? These are individual loans at a very small level. The macroeconomic issues are actually tied together, because what you're talking about is access to capital, right? Part of the reason the debt hurts our economy is because it takes away capital. So when we borrow $10 trillion more over the next 10 years before tax reform, so 11.5 plus interest with tax reform, that's 11.5 trillion that's taken out of the economy. That's savings. And so that's less capital available in the system that he's trying to facilitate and democratize. So yes, they shouldn't really be worried. They should be worried about their bottom line this week, this month. But as a nation, we need to worry about these big challenges, because ultimately it makes your job harder.
I mean, they all are linked together, right? Because people are so worried about their future, worried about, are their kids going to have a better life than what they had? Can they achieve any of the ambitions that they want? Are their jobs going to be around? That's causing changes in voting behavior and a number of things that we've seen in this past election. It's no surprise to me that the UK voted, on Brexit. Why? 40% of working families in the UK have under 100 pounds of savings. So, I mean, they think the system has abandoned them. And, we have to step up to that, I think. And if we can, I do think we can create stronger communities, stronger states, stronger economies.
Well, another bridge to the macro here, and let me throw this to Greg, is that the data show that small business formation is sort of at a low. It's really been declining. And the lending data shows that people are focused a lot on the FICO scores rather than other things they may use, and that's been maybe a result of Dodd-Frank. I don't know what the actual culprit is, but it's harder to form a small business, and it's harder to get a loan to form a small business, and that's taken some of the dynamism out of the U.S. economy.
Yes, and we're living in a period now of very slow productivity growth. I mean, to some extent, it might be an aftermath of the financial crisis, but a lot of people think it started before that. We're just in a period of very slow productivity growth, and we don't fully understand why, as macroeconomists, that is the case. The Trump administration says it's excessive regulation, and maybe there's some element of truth to that. But there's some economists who just think that technological progress has just not been as dynamic in the past decade as it had been, say, in the decades after World War II. There's some optimists out there. Eric Brynjolfsson at MIT is an optimist, and he's saying that the great productivity growth is around the corner. But we've been waiting for a while, and it hasn't showed up.
There's also the Robert Gordon school of thinking, which is that all the good stuff's been invented. If you haven't read Robert Gordon's book, I don't recommend that you read it.
It's very thick.
Straight through. It's something to leave at your bedside and read a chapter here or a chapter there. I don't think it's readable straight through, but it is a pillar of the argument of what's going on in the world today, in which Robert says that there's nothing in the iPhone or in the computer that rivals the gains from the locomotive, electricity, the steam engine, and the washing machine. He says all of those added to productivity in ways that the iPhone will not.
Yeah, well, the alternative argument is Hal Varian, the chief economist at Google,
Right.
who argues that the iPhone is an amazing thing because it's not just a phone, it's also a GPS, it's your camera, it's all sorts of other devices that's all stuck in one small,
Right,
very inexpensive
right.
package, and the GDP statistics don't capture that. And we're sort of mismeasuring productivity growth. In fact, things are better than we
So
think they are.
let me ask you a question. Instead of going to the bank the other day and taking out the money to pay the band, I sent them all money on PayPal. How was that efficiency captured in GDP?
Probably not very well, actually.
It didn't exist.
I mean, in some sense, it saved you time, I guess. I mean, that's the real benefit, is you didn't have to go to the bank. You actually did it very quickly.
It saved me
you
time.
time. Presumably, that time you could have maybe spent doing something else, like working. And
Had I
maybe-
worked and produced output in
Yes,
addition.
Yes. If instead of going to the bank, you'd like spend more time working, that would have been showed up in
So
GDP.
as far as the
But if you
economists
enjoyed-
are
but if you
concerned, I'm a
enjoyed-
lazy bum.
But if you enjoyed leisure, then no, it would not have shown. Yes, if you took the
It
extra
didn't
time.
exist in GDP.
That's right. If
Dan, you're useless. You didn't help. It didn't work at all.
My daughter says that all the time.
So but Dan, I mean, let me throw this at you because it's one of the things that's out there, right? Which is, what is it that Robert Solow said? Productivity every place except for in the economy.
except from the statistics.
Except for the statistics. How do you live in that world where you must see part of your mission as enhancing efficiencies and productivity, and it's so admirable the way you talk about what I hear you saying anyway is taking those efficiencies and productivities and putting them to social good. But are you seeing it in ways that should be but aren't showing up in the broader economy?
Again, it's hard for me to tell exactly what's being measured or not, but doing things electronically is so much more efficient from a cost and a time perspective. You send an international remittance right now. International remittances are one of the second largest capital infusion into developing countries. On average, it costs about between 8 and 9% traditionally through manual ways. Somebody waits 45 minutes on average overseas to pick up that cash, and then they're potentially a victim of crime. You do it electronically, you can cut 40 to 60% of that cost. Imagine that. That's like $20 billion of savings that could lift about 30 million people out of poverty. And then you've got all the time savings, that people have not waiting in lines. These are massive numbers, and I don't know, are they gonna take GDP up here or there? What I do know is the recipient of that remittance, when I'm sending it to you, as working here, sending it to you, wherever it may be, you have more money and you have more time. And that, to me, if we can then turn that into financial health in some way, can be really powerful.
I'm being told 1 minute. I thought we had another 30 minutes or 40. I got a lot more questions. Let me talk to Michael here because what he is thinking about is so important to what we're doing here. Michael, is there a way to think about teaching the public about the issues of government finance that relates in a way to their own personal experience? Because I think what Dan said is really interesting. They have $400 in the bank. They're not thinking, I mean, like me, either the 10th or the 13th, you get started these zeros, it's like, it becomes meaningless. And you hear people talking about this stuff and you get exasperated. They don't, what are the 2 or 3 things that you think, I mean, the teachers in this audience and the people out there that are doing the economic education, what's the message they need to communicate?
Well, I think what we've found is what works very well is talking about interest costs, actually, because people understand interest. They pay it on their car loans, their mortgages, et cetera. And so a lot of the statistics we throw out there relate to interest costs. So we're going to spend $6 trillion on interest over the next 10 years. At the end of that decade, interest will be the third largest government program. So things like that capture people's frustration because they say, we don't want to spend that much on interest. In 2 or 3 years, we're going to spend more on interest than we are investing in our kids. So things like that tend to capture it more than a big number with a lot of zeros on it. But they're balancing their books at home. They're balancing their books in their companies. They get it. I don't think it's a problem that they're getting it. I think it's a lack of leadership at the federal level.
I think I have to end it there, right, Nan? All right. I want to sincerely thank this great panel, Dan and Michael and Greg. And of course, I want to thank Nan again for having me out here.
Can you hear me? Yes. Whoa. So I also wanted to thank Dan and Michael and Greg. What you couldn't hear before was that they each pledged $10,000, so $30,000. So we hit $50,000 for tonight. We hit our goal for the paddle raise and for the evening. I am really humbled by your generosity. I wanted to thank our teacher award winners, our Sloan teacher award winners. We have all 3 from last year here as well. They're awesome. And my guy Steve for putting up with us. And really, his band is excellent. The Mooncusters will be up in Portchester on Saturday night. We're going. You should go. It's fabulous. Friday night. So, sorry, we'll go late probably too, right? What time?
About 1:30 or so.
You're kidding, right?
No, but we start. It's a dead band. We
I
play
know.
long.
I know. Oh, gee, well, okay. Some of you who get 5:30 a.m. emails from me know that I'm kind of an early to bed, early to rise girl, but I'll be there for you, Steve. And anyway, thank you all for coming this evening. We really appreciate it. This evening means so much to us, and it was so wonderful to see so many old friends and so many new faces here. So thank you all again, and we'll see you next year.
Mm-hmm.